every administration, it seems like, wants to come in, except this one, and take away, your right to have your own custody of your own digital assets, which is essentially trying to ban cash. It's trying to ban the digital equivalent of cash. I think if James Madison had settled for shall not prohibit on the right to keep and bear arms instead of shall not infringe.
Welcome, everybody. We are here for episode 2 of Bitcoin Politics. I am Frank Corva, the political correspondent for Bitcoin Magazine, joined by a very special guest today, Congressman Warren Davidson. Congressman Davidson, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to speak with us.
Frank, it's an honor. Thank you.
Pleasure is all ours. Super excited to have you here. I want to dive right in just because I know we have to be mindful of time. So you became a bit of the main character last week during the Genius Act and some of the discussion around it. You were unhappy with some of the language around CBDCs and how the bill treated that. Could you talk a little bit about what happened? And then if you're happy with the way that the final version, the signed bill, turned out?
Well, the Genius Act regulates stablecoins. And, frankly, the House had a different version that we passed. We called it the Stable Act. And in the normal course of events, the House would go to conference with the Senate and reconcile our differences because both products would matter. Ultimately, the White House chose, hey, we just want Genius, don't change it, just get it done. And they got a lot of good things done in the Genius Act, but there were concerns, and the House made amendments. And instead of putting them straight on the Genius Act, we added them to something called the Clarity Act, which is the market structure bill. So if you think about the market, stablecoins are currently about 7% of the market by market capitalization. And then the rest of the structure is the other 93%. So Clarity is the bill that deals with market structure. So amending that inherently doesn't necessarily mean that the Senate is even going to take up the things that we care about, because they didn't accidentally ignore them when they passed the Genius Act. So because of some of that dialogue, look, I think every member of financial services voted for the rule, and the rule sets the terms of debate. And the rule initially failed. And that's where, there were, lots of meetings, and I became kind of a technical advisor in those meetings. Here's what's true and here's what's not true. Bill Haggerty sat through a lot of those meetings, and I think initially he would explain his bill as, we did ban central bank digital currency. And that's true. They did ban the front end direct to consumer part of central bank digital currency. But that's exactly the answer. Chairman Hill, the House Chair of Financial Services, highlighted this a couple of years ago in a Q&A with Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, who said, yeah, we would need congressional approval to go with a retail CBDC, which is direct to consumer. But we are working to build a wholesale central bank digital currency, or a back-end framework that is essentially a central bank digital currency. And Chairman Hill highlighted that in a dialogue, I think in March of 2023. This leaves that framework intact, and part of the goal has been to turn it off. We had 5 other amendments, though, that really get into self-custody, commodity-backed stablecoins, state regulatory frameworks where Genius puts caps. So those differences matter. And because of that, we didn't really agree on what are the terms of this debate until the president got involved, and, I sat through a lot of those negotiations.
Okay. Well, I appreciate it. And I appreciate the fact that you're pushing back on things like a retail facing CBDC. I know that privacy is something that is important to you. And I wanted to bring up how at the Bitcoin Policy Summit a few weeks back now, you talked on stage about the Bank Secrecy Act and a lot of the surveillance around digital payments. And this isn't just around cryptocurrency. It exists because of the Bank Secrecy Act, which has existed since 1971. I was curious if maybe you could offer us some perspective on, can the Bank Secrecy Act ever be repealed? Should it be repealed? Is there any way to alter it to maybe give people a little bit more financial privacy?
Yeah, look, I do think the Bank Secrecy Act, laid the groundwork for too much surveillance in your banking. And honestly, that's what the market's telling us. If you look at like Bitcoin, it defines the market. And part of the reason was to move on from the current state of banking. One, yes, to move payment at the speed of light. The other part was to protect permissionless payments that have the characteristics of cash, where you don't depend on a third party to be able to facilitate the transaction or to permission the transaction. And frankly, the first fork in Bitcoin was whether the transactions would truly be immutable. Can you reverse a transaction? If the framework for a wholesale CBDC took on the characteristics of Bitcoin, true blockchain, Well, then I think I would be happy with that. It would protect some level of privacy. It's still auditable, so it's not truly secret, but privacy is protected. And that to me is a good future. But we're still fighting over what is that future really going to be like, because some people want essentially managed, essentially controlled, really database. It's not true blockchain, in my opinion, but it does execute trades faster. It does process things faster. And, you can see companies that really have bet billions or tens of billions of dollars on creating that kind of ledger that the Federal Reserve is essentially trying to implement. So they're not going to give up on what they've invested so much capital on without intervention by Congress. And without congressional action, we're not going to really undo really United States versus Miller that locked in this third party doctrine, which is the ridiculous idea that if you share your data with a third party, therefore you have no expectation of privacy. You can't really operate without a bank. You certainly can't operate without a bank in an era where essentially managed central bank digital currency is the way you have access to the payment rails. And that's true on so many other things. Like you can't really operate your own email service. So there's so many things where privacy is infringed, but payments is the main topic here. And we're fighting for that future.
Yeah, but we appreciate that. And we appreciate the work that you're doing. On this topic of payments, there's actually a really interesting clause in the Clarity Act where it talks about developers of non-controlling, or which would be otherwise known as non-custodial technology, don't necessarily have to get a money transmitter license, or they're not serviced to money transmitter laws. Your thoughts on this? Is this something that's really important, something that you're paying attention to as the bill develops now in the Senate? The new draft was released today. This language was included in the bill. They've kept this sort of language in the bill.
Yeah, I think that's the right language. And look, this is basically when Congress wisely passed the Telecommunications Act of 1996. They treated platforms as neutral. They didn't say we're going to hold YouTube accountable for every video that users upload, or as an example. So eBay is not necessarily responsible for how somebody acquired the goods they're selling on eBay. They can't knowingly facilitate illicit activity, but their platform's neutral. They don't do everything about it all. They don't carry over all the liability for the person that would commit a criminal act. And I think that's the right answer on speech. Software is really just speech. So how could you be held accountable for someone else's speech? And this came to a head with Tornado Cash and the Samurai wallet. And DOJ basically wanted to ignore all the guidance that FinCEN had provided for a decade and start prosecuting really very selectively Tornado Cash and Samurai wallet. And so thankfully that kind of is unwound now. And hopefully we can lock in the temporarily just outcome there so that it doesn't have to happen to anyone else.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought those two up. Thank you for doing so. I've been actually in all of the pretrial hearings for the Samurai case, in touch with their legal defense, and I've been covering the Tornado Cash trial. I think we're in day 7 of the trial now. Stayed home today to speak with you, so I'm glad that we're able to talk about this. At least it's really important that people understand this. And the defense in the Tornado Cash case said just yesterday, I said, well, would you ban VPNs? Would you ban privacy apps like WhatsApp or Signal, places where people can communicate with privacy because of encryption? So with these cases, do you think if maybe there's an outcome like, let's say Roman Storm, who's the developer who's on trial now for the Tornado Cash case, do you think that there's going to be, let's say Clarity passes, do you think that this is going to give the defense some leverage to say, hey, look, we have a law on the books now that says developers of non-custodial tech should not be persecuted or prosecuted for this? Do you think that's going to give them any leverage at all?
Well, I hope the big thing is to make sure no one else has to go through what they went through. I think there are people that say if we pass a law, it basically says, see, we needed to pass a law because those guys were lawbreakers. I don't agree that they're lawbreakers. They were following the guidance that was out there. I don't think the case should have ever been brought. I'd love to see DOJ just dismiss it, or the SEC dismiss it. They're wrong to go after these folks today. And it just highlights the urgency of protecting, software code as speech. And I think the other thing is, if you look at privacy and speech, self-custody, the right to transact, every administration, it seems like, wants to come in, except this one, and take away, your right to have your own custody of your own digital assets, which is essentially trying to ban cash. It's trying to ban the digital equivalent of cash.
Yep.
And people say, well, that's already your right. Why would you want to pass a law? Well, because people keep trying to infringe it. And I think, think if James Madison had settled for, shall not prohibit on the right to keep and bear arms instead of shall not infringe. And, because it was such strong language, people don't have to go through this overly burdensome path to be able to own firearms in most states. Whether you agree or disagree on firearms, the language there is really important. And when you come into protecting software or protecting self-custody, the details do matter on these bills. So while Genius built us some good momentum, we're really hoping to kind of correct some of the details with the Clarity Act that really fixes the stablecoin bill, or at least makes it a little better. And then, the details that we're fighting for over in the Senate really do matter. And my initial reaction is they get a lot of good things right in their draft.
Okay. Appreciate that. Two last things actually based on that response, which I appreciated. So one of the big acts that will codify into law this idea of the right for people to hold their private keys is the Bitcoin Act. It'll also codify the SPR into law. And some people say, well, it's not really necessary because, as you just mentioned, code is protected. It's free speech and all this, but people do continually try to infringe on this. We've seen this, right? Is there going to be enough momentum? Let's just say after clarity passes in a perfect world, is there going to be enough momentum to get to the Bitcoin Act? And whether the version that Senator Lummis has introduced in the Senate or Congressman Nick Begich has introduced in the House, are we hopefully going to get there and before midterms at that?
Yeah, I don't know. I think you're right that a lot depends on, what the momentum comes out of clarity. And really, if we can get central bank digital currency banned, I think across the board unilaterally, because President Trump's executive order gets all these things right. And he also set up the Bitcoin reserve. And, it's really crazy to think of how the federal government was managing custody of all these digital assets. They want to go after private sector for all kinds of things on custody, but they didn't really hold themselves accountable for custody. They've lost control of all kinds of assets, and they've foolishly, sold off all kinds of Bitcoin when they should have been holding it. It's definitely an appreciating asset. I think this administration wisely recognized, hey, we want to hold Bitcoin, and the other digital assets that we get, we'll look at them on a case by case basis, and we're open to selling them and purchasing Bitcoin with the money that we get from selling off, say pump and dump scam coins that they confiscate through illicit activity. So
Yeah.
central custodian makes sense because they're losing track of custody on a lot of things, and the idea that Treasury really looks at it as a scarce resource is long overdue.
Yeah, appreciate that. I'm curious. So you referenced, you talked about code as speech. You talked about the first Bitcoin fork. I'm just kind of curious on a personal level. You obviously, I'm sure that maybe you're sort of familiar with the PGP wars of the '90s, and you've obviously been following Bitcoin for some time. Just kind of curious as to maybe when you got into Bitcoin, or maybe even just generally speaking, privacy. And it's just coming from a personal angle here. Just kind of seeing the depth of knowledge that you have on this topic.
Well, when the internet era was going in the early 2000s, I mean, look, I graduated high school in the 80s. I mean, we didn't have a computer lab in my high school until I was a senior, and the freshmen had like computer lab. We had like two computers in the library. So I didn't really grow up around all that. I had a few friends that had a PC or a Commodore 64. And then through the Army years, I saw, the early 90s .com going on. But by the time I was out of the Army and manufacture in the early 2000s, like when are payments going to be able to move at the speed of light? And I was kind of aware of DigiCash and eGold and kind of the way people went after that. And I felt like I was so behind the curve when I learned about Bitcoin in 2012. It was already years old at that point. And by 2013 it felt late. I was like, wow, I kind of missed the moment on getting into Bitcoin mining. And who knows, maybe things would have turned out a little differently had I made that switch from manufacturing to Bitcoin. But I got into Bitcoin because I had vendors out of the United States, and I would send payments, and they would say, well, I haven't received the money. I'm like, well, here's the wire transfer instructions. Your bank has received the money. And they're like, well, that's great, but my bank hasn't given me the money. And so on one end or the other, between the banks and the governments backdooring everything, we were burning like a week on projects where days would matter. And we were both frustrated. My
Mm.
customers were frustrated. I was frustrated. My suppliers were frustrated. And it's like, surely there's a solution to it. And permissionless peer to peer payments that move at the speed of light is the solution. And we were really excited to, see this innovation.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. Last question. I know you have to go. Just in terms of conversations around digital assets in general, Bitcoin and digital assets, it was good to see clarity pass out of the House, but I think I've been in a lot of the Senate hearings, the Finance Committee hearings on market structure, the few that have existed so far. And I think about what former CFTC chair Tim Massad said. He just feels a lot like Groundhog's Day. He said, like, we just keep sort of doing the same conversation over and over and not necessarily getting there. I was just wondering if maybe you could give us some insight. Obviously, I know you're in the House, but is the Senate maybe getting somewhere behind the scenes? Do you have any insight into this? And are you hopeful that clarity will pass?
Well, look, I introduced the Token Taxonomy Act in 2018, and it basically was the market structure bill. It would define, what is a security and what is not, a bright line test. And that is, bright line test is the core of the Clarity Act. It's clear this would be a regulated security. It's clear this would be a commodity. It's clear this would be a real world asset regulated, like a real world asset. And how do we properly structure it? The House finally got there. We got Fit 21 across the finish line last Congress, and now we've got clarity across the finish line, and it's a better product. There is more momentum in the Senate, but frankly, going into the debate last week, a lot of the senators that I talked to, Senate staffers, lobbyists, journalists in the space, all felt like there really wasn't momentum in the Senate. And frankly, that's part of where some of the senators are like, you guys need to really have a fight over this in the House so that the White House gets more engaged with the Senate. Having said that, look, while the House generally does get in line and support the president pretty quickly, senators just seem to not care what the president says, what the Speaker of the House says, or frankly, anyone else. They got their own kind of rhythm over there. So
Okay.
I hope that they, noticed how much momentum came out of last week and they don't lose it. I hope in September they get clarity done with nothing but improvements to it. And it seems like they're off to a decent start to that. So I'm rooting for their success. And I hope they don't forget about the changes that really are important to not just us, but our constituents and a lot of folks in the industry that would improve Genius. It's a pretty good bill, but I think it'd be a much better bill with our amendments.
Okay. Well, I appreciate it. Any final thoughts? Anything we didn't touch on that you wanted to mention before we wrap up here?
No, I'd just like to say thanks, to Bill Haggerty and congratulations on Genius. Thanks to Chairman Hill and the work to get things out of the House. And really, a vast number of staffers that have done work on this for years. This is a long time in the making. We're not quite done yet, so let's run through the tape and get it done.
Appreciate it. Well, Congressman Davidson, thank you so much for your time. We sincerely appreciate it, and we appreciate the work that you're doing on the Hill over there.
Yeah, thanks for covering it.
Pleasure is all ours. We'll talk soon, sir.
All right, take care.